Hello, and welcome to another tale from the lands of Ashraka. I'm Zeckthar, and without further ado, Chapter 4 of the Liberator of Rhodes, titled Strange Connections.
Bovin rapped lightly on the thick cedar door, dressed in a formal green chiton and a light sky blue silk tunic, a gift from the Khan. The large Minotaur scratched his shoulder nervously. With his other hand, he tugged on his tunic, straightening an imaginary wrinkle, even though it needed no such attention. He was far more comfortable in his usual battle attire, a steel breastplate and leather and steel chiton. The lack of weight made him feel uncomfortable, especially the lack of his weapons hanging over his shoulders. He felt as if he was dressed in someone else's attire. This courting nobles was not something he had ever been comfortable with. The backstabbing, double-dealing, and swindling all done behind courtly smiles and grand parties honestly turned his stomach. That was not to say he wasn't good at it. Honestly, he thought that was why the king of the Carthaginian Isles was so eager to send him and the army on a quest. Generals of political power did not stay that way for long. Soon they became kings, or dead. Yet he had to admit, both shirt and skirt were tailored for his unusual size, and it fit well, as close to comfortable as any fine attire could be. He had not been waiting long until the door creaked open, and a sliver of light from inside the villa flooded through the darkened street. His eyes gained focus to the light to see a small female human peering through the slit in the door. "Name, sir?" she whispered past the thick door.
Bovin Ironhoof,
the Minotaur responded, leaning down to her level and speaking in a hushed tone. The girl could not be more than 10, and he did not wish to startle her. The girl looked over the list she had been given and then bowed. "Greetings, Ironhoof. My mistress has been expecting you." Opening the door all the way, golden candlelight flooded the street, chasing away the hungry shadows. The timid slave then ushered the large bovine in. She shut the door behind him with a resounding thud, then locked a bolt across the knob, sealing the Minotaur inside. "Please, follow me, sir. You are one of the first to arrive."
Really?
The girl smiled. "Yes, you are. Only a few friends have shown up, and a funny dwarf, Malork Hellbringer."
Funny?
The Minotaur queried with more than a little shock. "Oh, yes." The girl giggled with unbridled glee. "He acts grumpy. It is just a ruse. He tells such funny stories."
He does he? I can enjoy an amusing tale.
With a goofy grin, she beckoned him to follow her down the hall until they came to an opening. If they continued straight, Bovin assumed they probably would have run into the bedrooms, maybe the kitchen. Instead, they turned to the right and entered a large, uncovered pavilion with a quiet fountain gurgling in the center. The fountain depicted Apollo, Roman god of light, kneeling across 3 steps. His bow was aimed towards the sun, as if coming up in the morning to the east. Water poured from the tip of the arrow into the small pool beneath the god, completing the fountain. This pond was surrounded by coals, with small pieces of wood crackling atop them, warming the open-aired pavilion. The god of the sun was not only surrounded by water, but by the fires of the sun. Couches surrounded the warmth of the fire, with a few people lounging on them, none of which Bovin recognized. To the left of the fountain scene was something that Bovin was far more interested in, and the rumblings of his stomach told him to march his feet post-haste towards the spectacle. A large spread of food covered a massive 15-foot table, and the smell was the most sensual thing he had ever smelled in his life. At the start of the table was true Roman delicacies: roast goose, dormouse sautéed in a spice-brown sauce, and one of his favorites, tortellini, in a light pesto sauce. Of course, there was garlic breads and different dipping oils on the third of the table, as well as a fresh baby tomatoes, along with a few salads as well. As his mouth watered, his eyes caught something he had simply heard about, a strange new dish that had gained notoriety while he had been away from the island, something he had only heard rumors about. It was simply known in Latin as pizza. A round, thin-pan bread with a heady crust. It was baked with cheese and tomato sauce. It had become a most sought-after dish. The interesting thing he had heard was that each pizza had different ingredients known as toppings added to it, giving each dish a different taste. It looked like the pizza on the table was known as a Syracuse classic. Thin slices of cured ham and a strange fruit known as a pineapple, something Bovim was familiar with. They grew in the heat of the Southlands, ruled by the tyrants of the Mahi. His mouth began to water. He had tasted such fruits up north. A Kikini had offered him a piece of the fruit, and it had been delicious. He almost made his way to the table when a powerful arm grabbed him around the waist and squeezed. "Bovim, glad you made it," Malork said with gusto. Bovim grinned. As amusing as the adopted brother of the Khan's antics were on the ocean, it was good to see the dwarf back to his old self. Bovim had met the dwarf before his trials upon the water. They had been introduced on the march towards the Jotunice. At first, they had not gotten along, very much to Bovim's own ignorance. Yet, they were both warriors at heart. Each yearned for the battlefield. That was a far simpler life. Kill or be killed. Those that killed, heroes. Those that died, failed. Yet died for a purpose, meaning they gave everything, and therefore, heroes. It did not take long for the two true warriors on the same battle lines to come to an understanding. Friendship was not the right word. The better word was known as Krieger by the dwarves. The Romans had a name for it too. They called it Bellator. Both had a simple concept. It was more and less than a friendship. Fight for a cause, die for a cause. Your brothers are not of blood. They are to your left and right on the line. To hear the sweet music of the advancing horn is true ecstasy. To crush all foes is the glory and the right of all who stand on the line. And to do so was known as one sacred word, valor. Those that died defending their line, a different word, honor. While friendliness was beginning to grow between the two, Bovim would fight to his death on the battlefield to save the dwarf, and Malork would have done the same for him. Not for friendship's sake, for a fellow soldier who held the line. Embracing the dwarf in kind, he said eagerly,
"Well met, Malork. Have you eaten anything at the table yet? Anything you might recommend?"
"The pizza is delicious, but don't fill yourself on it, even though it would be easy. Might I suggest the opposite end of the table? Delicacies from the Cabal. Never thought I would like snake, yet the blend between reptile, seafood, and pasta is truly worth trying." Looking towards the far end of the table the dwarf was pointing at, Bovim was truly shocked. It was a whole pile of food that he'd never even seen. Large bowls held pasta, the only thing he recognized. Mainly long flour noodles, such as linguine and fettuccine. In the center of the noodle piles was 3 vats of liquid, each holding their own interesting aroma. The greatest smelling to the young Minotaur was the one that held a grayish-colored sauce. Mushrooms bubbled across the top of the liquid, as well as sliced black olives. Walking over, he grasped the ladle that waited patiently on the side of the cauldron for customers. Lifting it, he glanced at the contents and was surprised to see clams, as well as shrimp. "Ah, Bellator Rex, I am so glad you made it," Helga said from across the table. "By all means, sample Leftke Lickwoman. It is one of my favorite dishes." Lifting the ladle to his lips, Bovim blew across the liquid, cooling the heated fluid. Hesitantly, he lapped his tongue out to taste the strange substance, and was immediately glad that he did. Savory tangs of spiciness and a twinge of saltiness, not overpowering, but present, filled his jowls with such a pleasant taste that it was overpowering. He didn't even think. He just reacted. Holding the ladle high above his head, he opened his jaws and poured the contents into his mouth. The shocked gasps from the guests did little to dissuade his thoughts. This sauce was fit for the gods. Taking 3 chews, he swallowed the contents in his mouth and smiled.
"Majesty, sir, I must compliment your chef. This is by far the best noodle sauce I have ever tasted."
Helga chortled, a goofy grin on her face. Bowing low, she responded, "Why, thank you, sir. I think this is probably the most unusual, yet by far the most heartfelt compliment I have ever received." You cook the meal? Malark asked with unrestrained shock on his face. Helga shrugged. Sure, the day-to-day meals in my villa are made by the kitchen staff. But when guests come over, that's when I prefer to cook. Mind you, I have help from the kitchens, yet every dish you see on this table, I personally had a hand in. Bovim grinned eagerly, then bowed to the madam of the house.
You surprise me, Magister. With such hands-on experience, I will do what all wise soldiers do.
Grabbing a plate from the side of the table, he dipped his horned head again and said,
Pray tell, fine lady, what shall I eat?
The strength of the dwarves always confused Bovim. How could something that small be as strong as he, a massive minotaur? Yet he was shocked to find Helga grab the plate out of his hand with her right, then gingerly scooped him around the waist and very gently picked him up with her left. She then carried him calmly towards the middle of the table. By all means, Rex, you must try my favorite dish. Something from my homeland, Ice Kaiser. Setting him gently down next to the table, she lightly reached out towards the middle of the table, latching on to a large spoon that sat in a bowl of mashed potatoes. Peculiarly, as she daubed the ladle in and pulled it out, strings were attached to the mashed clump of vegetable. Upon further inspection, he realized it was a cheese of an orange color. He assumed cheddar. He wondered slightly about it for a second, then realized he didn't have time, as she scooped out 4 meatballs in a rich brown sauce and dumped them onto the potatoes. Gosh balls, Malark said with excitement. Where on earth did you get the recipe? Handing the plate of food to Bovim, the Magister Artis of Syracuse bowed deeply to Malark and said quietly, I may be Roman now, but I was not always such. I was captured when I was just a child by the Caranus raid during the Beard Elvian War. Malark growled at the statement, but beckoned her to continue. It is the only thing I can remember from my life before this. A recipe my mother taught me when I was very young. Sorry, lass. Those were dark times. Thinking back to history, Bovim vaguely recalled a war on the main continent with that name. A war between the elder races of the north, the dwarves and the elves. It had lasted 50 brutal years, until peace was resolved about 5 years ago. While peace remained, most would describe it to be tentative at best. Scooping a healthy bite of food into his mouth, he realized this was even better than the left K Luckwamin. He damn near swooned. As he chewed, he mused about such a brutal war. The dwarves were a sturdy bunch that fought very much like the Romans did. Hardened lines of solid troops, slowly moving forward towards the enemy like the movement of time itself. Simple, inevitable. The elves, on the other hand, were fast and aggressive, precise and accurate. They laid waste to all that stood before them. Such people as enemies must have been catastrophic. Very much the unstoppable force striking the immovable object. Yet, he had just recently seen how dangerous these two races were when they put aside their differences. In the War of the North, a coalition of all races, of all the world, held their ground against demonkind, and prevailed. His thoughts were interrupted as Malark continued. Have you looked for your kin, now that you hold a rank in the city? With a sad grimace, the lady of the house shook her head. I don't need to. I was from Alcom. Malark gasped. Bovim noticed the warrior's eyes widen. Then they began to mist. A single tear was scooped off his face by the grizzled hand, leaving his rugged features looking tired and aged. He opened his mouth to speak, yet the warrior dwarf had no words to say, no concept of comfort to give.
I don't understand,
Bovim interjected. With a confused look at his host, continued.
My apologies for my ignorance, but what is this Alcom?
With a sad smile, Helga answered, although by the time she was done, Bovim truly wished he could have just continued eating this glorious food in blissful ignorance. Alcom was a small city, directly south of the capital. Small compared to the capital, Karzadin. It was still a massive hub of commerce. It was a young yet prosperous city, with a strong population of 75,000, growing every day. This was because it was far behind the front lines to the east, and we sat directly at a 90-degree mark from Irkutsk and Yuropok, making the crossing area for all three kingdoms to do trade. We lived with little fear of the war, and all was well. That's when the raid came. The Dark Elves had crept through the tunnels with a large raiding party, moving well within our army's perimeter. Some say they actually moved across the surface, instead of lurking past our guards in the tunnels. And I would have to agree. There's no way an army that size could get past our sentries in the tunnels, at least not without giving us some warning. They came in the dark, killing all that stood before them. Only those that they kept to trade as slaves survived the next 3 days. It took that long to finish off all of my kin. Male, female, young, old. It did not matter. All were put to the torch. Of the 75,000, only 1,000 of us were sold into slavery. The rest were butchered, be it in the initial siege or the games. Helga shuddered, remembering an old thought, something that she had put out of her mind, yet now with the retelling came crashing back into her consciousness. The games were what they called it. They pitted dwarf against dwarf in arenas, sometimes sons fighting mothers, or fathers fighting their toddler children. Those that refused were impaled upon a stake, still alive. Until they died, their kin were forced to watch them slowly expire, unless they took the life of the impaled themselves. This is what the Khoranists call fun. The Dark Elves continue the fun until the 3rd day, hearing of a large dwarven force moving into the area, so they needed to flee. Yet instead of executing those that were impaled with a beheading or stabbed to the chest, they set them alight, so the families could watch them burn to death. A few of those that watched were spared, yet just for a life of slavery. The rest were allowed to live until the staked individuals expired. Then they were used as target practice for the elves. With a snarl, Helga said, "Khoranists are excellent shots, with those repeating crossbows of theirs. Yet they fired into the legs of the fleeing dwarves to watch them try to drag themselves to safety, then laugh until they were almost out of range, and then continued to fire into their backs. When they left the city, they left it standing, a hollow ghost. All that remained were the dead." Shaking the past from her thoughts, she continued, I was lucky. Out of the 1,000 of us left, only about 30 of us were sold to a merchant from Rome. The rest were forced to work in the mines in the dark city Moscow.
"How on earth did we ally with such an evil race?"
Bovin said in horror, realizing the dwarf was done with her tale. "Unfortunately, it was a profitable alliance," an unknown voice answered behind Bovin. All three turned to look at the new voice, and Helga gasped with delight. "Marcus! What a pleasure!" Taking 2 steps, she embraced an old man Bovin had never seen before. By the way he responded, the two were good friends. Short, even by Roman standards, he was only a head taller than the dwarf. Peppered black and gray hair that was just long enough to be combed back showed that he was an older man. The raptor gaze that he used to survey the room, on the other hand, told there was still a youthful hunger for the hunt. Giving Helga an extra squeeze, he pulled her at arm's length and grinned at the host. "It is so good to see you again, Helga. It has been far too long. Why, I believe the last time we spoke was 5 months ago. Yes, you came to my place in Rome to enjoy Saturnalia." "Yes, I must say for a human you have the most impressive memory," Helga chuckled. "But as I am glad to see you, how on earth do you know I was entertaining tonight?" With a sly grin, the older man said, "One of your guests invited me." Dipping his head in a short bow, he grinned wolfishly at Malork. "Good to see you again, Master Hellbringer. Hope the food is to your liking." He then glanced at Bovin and bowed deeply, and upon his rise extended a hand. "You must be Bovin Ironhoof. A pleasure to meet your acquaintance. I am Marcus Crassus." As he shook the Roman's hand, alarm bells kicked him hard in the gut. This was a man to be cautious around. He was not what he seemed. Nothing about the elder man hinted of danger, yet he had learned long ago to trust his instincts. This one deserved watching.
Pleasure to meet you,
Bovin said, trying to force a natural smile onto his face.
You were saying something about profits?
The smile faded from Crassus's face. Yes, I did. The Senate and the people of the island of Rome were paid handsomely for staying out of the war, as well as a large influx of slaves at lower costs. With a sad shake of his head, Marcus continued stating, I myself gained through the last 10 years of the war a 50% increase in profits from the Elven Empire, something that continues to be a boon for me. Things have changed, though, the Roman added hastily. Rome no longer purchases slaves from the Dark Elves, per the decree of the new leader of the Dark Race, a friend of the Khans, I believe, a beautiful yet deadly sorceress by the name of Miststrike Poisonblade. Now, I simply trade olives for jade.
You're a slave trader?
Malort growled. Bovin agreed with his sentiments. As far as he was concerned, slave trade was for pirates and vagabonds. The aspect of slavery was still known in the small kingdom of Carthage, yet it was rare, and slavery was probably the wrong word for it. You could be sold into slavery in his land, yet you were paid, as well as provided food and shelter. The term that was normally used was called serf. It was normally not a very good life, yet it was paradise compared to a slave on the ships of the small islands. Working on this aspect was still something that Bovin didn't like. He had visited other countries in the world and found the kingdom that he lived in lacking, dare he say, even ignorant. Bovin's thoughts were interrupted by Crassus' response. Very little of what I do now is the slave trade. We have tried to move on from that. Honestly, the only part of the market I imbibe in is prisoners, mostly murderers and career criminals. Bovin was about to ask where his money was being earned now, when he saw Octavius stride into the room. With a slight grin, Ironhoof scooped up a fork, dipped his head to those involved in the conversation, and said,
My apologies. I must greet a friend. Thank you for the advice on the food. If it is as good as your Luftke liquamen or kosh balls, then I am glad that I don't live under your roof. If I was, I would grow far too fat, and probably no longer able to move myself off a couch.
Taking a deep bow, he stabbed the fork into the potatoes, then snatched Helga's hand and gently kissed it. Then, without a word, he stepped away from the table and the conversation to greet his friend. Bovin was stuffed. He could not remember a time he had eaten so much good food. Good food? No, this was not simply good food. He had eaten a meal fit for the gods. Sipping on a light red wine the hostess had pulled from her private cellar, he mused over the night's events as he lounged on one of the couches next to the fiery fountain. About 15 other guests had showed up, and all seemed to be in as good a cheer as himself. He had enjoyed simple conversation with most that had attended, and the few he hadn't, he had simply avoided for the rest of the meal. Octavius was simply fascinating to watch, weaving his way through conversations as if he were a glacial stream, winding its way through the mountains. By this point in the night, everyone at the party knew his name, and they all had nothing but kind words to say about him. This was his element, the politics and intrigues of the court, and her peoples. On the battlefield, he was a decent soldier, but compared to the way he worked a crowd... Bovin shook his head in amazement. The lad had a gift, and he was using it well. Cigar? A quiet voice asked him. Turning his head lazily, he noticed the young girl that had opened the door earlier for him was passing out cigars on a silver platter. Sitting up on the couch, he gently lifted one of the smokes to his nostril. With a sniff, he grinned. This was fine tobacco. Most likely dwarven.
Thank you, miss,
Bovin said with a slight bow of his head.
Unfortunately, I have nothing to light it with.
The little girl grinned with eager mischief. Glancing around until she noticed Helga wasn't looking in her area, the girl snapped her fingers. A small blue flame magically emerged from the palm of her hand. Quickly, before I am spotted, the girl hissed. Needing no further instructions, the Minotaur quickly started the cherry at the end of the cigar. With a massive plume of smoke, he smiled at the child.
Thanks,
he said quietly.
What's your name, girl?
Emily, she said with a whisper. Bovin looked into the girl's eyes. Even though she held the lowest station one could possibly hold in life, there was still energy and excitement for life. Sitting all the way up, he extended a hand.
Well, it is a pleasure to meet you, Emily. My name is Bovin Ironhoof.
The girl dipped her head in a bow and, taking his hand in a shake, said with a giggle, "A pleasure, but I already know your name. I was the one that let you in."
Still cheeky.
This one has spirit, the large bull thought with a grin.
Helga!
Bovin boomed, a little louder than he expected to, yet it had the desired effect from the hostess, getting her attention. Unfortunately, it had the opposite effect on Emily. She squeaked and tried to scramble away, yet the Minotaur held her by the hand. There was no escaping his firm grasp. She was stuck. "Master Rex, would you please let go of my slave?" Helga said, hurrying over. The look on her face was an alarm, worry for her charge. "Has she done something to offend?"
No, she has not. And no, I will not. Not until I have a price,"
Bovin said in a much quieter voice. It took the dwarf a second, and then she smiled and said, No. The cigars are a gift to my guests. No coin is needed." Releasing a big cloud of smoke, Bovin tucked the tip of the cigar into the corner of his mouth and answered,
"Thank you for the gift. It is indeed fine tobacco." "Yet, that is not what I meant. I asked you for the price of this slave. Emily was the name she gave me."
Helga's eyes went wide, but they paled in comparison to the little girl's eyes. They were the size of saucers. Fumbling into his coin purse, the Minotaur produced a large diamond, about the size of a gold coin, and said,
"I would assume this would suffice."
Helga Jernska looked like a fox that had been caught in a snare. Bovin could see the mind racing, and he held his breath, waiting for the response. Seconds passed until the dwarf dipped her head and extended her hand, saying, "Payment accepted." Bovin handed her the diamond, then turned his attention towards the little girl. Her skin had become cold and pale. A look of utter terror was displaced across her face. She had just been sold to a Minotaur.
"Emily, hand me your collar,"
Bovin said quietly. The girl hastily pulled the iron cord from around her neck and handed it to Bovin. Gripping it tightly, the Minotaur stood, towering over the child. Looking down at the human, all he saw was terror. Bovin spoke, firmly, for all those to bear witness, yet calmly.
"No longer are you a slave, Emily, and no longer are you tied to this house."
Taking the iron cord, he handed it to the quaking child. He then knelt so he was face to face with the dumbfounded girl.
"You will live in my house, by my side. I give you my name, and all that it pertains. No longer are you simply Emily, a Roman slave. You will be known as Emily Ironhoof, adopted daughter of Bovin Ironhoof."
Still wide-eyed, all the girl could do was squeak. With a warm smile, Bovin added in a quieter whisper, taking the girl into his confidence, saying,
"You may choose what you wish. I will not throw you back into servitude if you refuse my adoption. You're free to do as you will. I cannot offer you what most would enjoy, a quiet life of contentment. What I can offer is a life of struggle, hardship, and adventure. I offer you a chance to seize life by the throat. Take my offer, and the wonders of the world are yours. All that is required is that you take them."
Bovin winced slightly to himself. That was an offer few adults could refuse, let alone a child. The girl's eyes no longer held terror, only wonder and excitement. Taking a second to glance down at the iron cord, she turned and tossed it into the burning coals of the fountain. "Okay, Dad," Emily said with glee. With a deep chuckle, Bovin ruffled the lass's hair. Standing up straight, Bovin took the cigar out of his mouth and said,
"Right. Now that is settled, first thing is first. Go get some food at the table."
If the girl was astounded at first, now she was truly baffled. I can't," she stammered.
"Hostess Helga,"
Bovin said loudly, turning towards the stunned dwarf.
"I assume the bounty of your table is acceptable for my daughter, yes?"
The dwarf, still shocked with the turn of affairs, snapped back to attention and smiled. "But of course. Perhaps I could suggest—" That was all the kid needed. With a squeal of glee, she beelined it towards the pizza, and after scooping up at least 3 slices, she began to devour them. Shrugging at the stunned dwarf, Bovin smiled.
Sorry, Magister. Girls will be girls.
Helga shook her head and then asked the simple question Bovin was sure he would be asked by anybody after this life-changing decision. Why? Keeping his true idea as his own, he pointed at the child. The two watched the eagerness of his new daughter as she tore into the slice of pizza she was eating, eyes closed in complete contentment of the taste she had only dreamed of. A fresh piece of pizza. The Minotaur shook his head with a chuckle.
It was the right thing to do. To chain a free spirit such as hers. That would be truly criminal.
Taking a puff from the cigar, the general of the client kingdom of Carthage began to wonder, almost panic at the decision he had made. Who was he to have a daughter, let alone a human daughter? What did he know about children, or raising them? A slight concept of doom held his psyche, and then he saw something that washed all those fears aside. The girl turned and gave him a grin. It was full of life, eagerness, and best of all, goofy. Seeing that pizza-filled grin, all Bovin could do was chuckle. Glancing back at the dwarf, he said something only he at this point could understand.
How could I not?
Crassus watched the spectacle from start to finish from across the room with a frown. While most would see what the Minotaur did as outrageously generous, Crassus saw it for what it was. The general had just adopted a fledgling magic user. Few on the small continent of Rome could wield the winds of magic, not since the fall of the last king, Lucius Tarquinius, some 1,000 years ago. Nobody really knew why, and only about a handful were born every decade. Most went unnoticed, yet some, like himself, discovered the ability at a young age and began to hone it. While they were few in number, the wizards that came out of Rome were some of the most powerful in the world, and Bovin Ironhoof just bought the use of one for a diamond worth maybe 200 pieces of gold. Not only had he done this, but he had also garnered the undying loyalty of the magic user for a piece of pizza. Lork was right. This one is dangerous, the old man mused darkly. Something must be done about this one. Chapter 5. Elves. Malork sat on a couch and slugged down a gulp of beer. With a smile, he chuckled. He couldn't help himself, watching Bovin and Emily interact. If he hadn't seen the adoption an hour ago himself, he never would have known they had just recently met. At that moment, she curled up in his lap, sound asleep, as the massive bovine rumbled a lullaby quietly. The party had subsided by now, and only himself, the happy pair, Crassus, Helga, and Octavius remained, all sitting or lounging on couches next to the warming fountain. "All right, Crassus, what news of Rome?" Octavius asked the elder man. "Helga told me Nero Craxus has taken the Roman seat of consul." That garnered Malork's attention. Shifting his gaze, he watched Crassus. The elder statesman frowned as he responded. "Yes, what you say is true. Pompey Magnus died in his sleep. Not a bad death for any Roman. The only way to go better would be at a sword in one's hand." Helga nodded. "A true Roman. Pity us for his passing. Yet the glory of Olympus awaits such a servant of Rome." "Hear, hear," Octavius echoed, raising a glass of wine. "To Pompey Magnus." After the toast and a sip of his wine, Octavius continued, saying, "Yet you say Graxus now holds Pompey's old seat at the Senate? How on earth did he do that?" "Nero has the will of the people backing him," Crassus chuckled. "Rome is enthralled with the young man. They would have to be. What naming him tribune and consul?" Octavius gasped. Bovin snorted, interrupting the slow song he was singing to his child, and catching the attention of the party. Apparently, Malork's ears weren't the only ones to be perked by the conversation.
"Excuse me, Helga. Perhaps you have a bed that Emily might slumber in, until I take my leave back to the ship."
"Of course," Helga said, motioning a servant to scoop the child up. As she was gently carried off around the corner, Bovin watched her go with a smile, and then turned to the remaining party guests with a scowl.
"He holds both offices? Has the Senate gone mad?"
"The Roman side of the Senate holds him in high regard, other than those few who see him as an enemy of the state, Crassus said. And those few have either fled the city, or have been disposed of.
What of the Greeks?
Octavius mused. Surely they would have tried to put a stop to this insanity. Pyrrhus is mustering the Spartan legions on the east side of the continent, yet he is loath to march on the capital. Instead, he has done something far wiser than all-out revolt. He has levied heavy taxes on Latin products, and has placed trade embargoes on all Greek supplies. Helga answered. I have not seen any Corinthian ships at the docks for at least 3 months. Indeed, Crassus echoed. This is causing the prices of everywhere to skyrocket. It has brought Graxus and the Roman city back to the table, yet at a cost.
What of Rhodes? Where does she stand in this?
The islands of Carthage have remained silent, Crassus answered. Unusually so. Some say that the king of Rhodes has been hypnotized by magic, frozen to his throne. Others say he is simply waiting to see which side gains the upper hand, and then supports them. I'm afraid it is worse than that, Helga said quietly, gathering the attention of the room. In a quiet voice she continued. Since you left with the army, I have not seen a single commercial ship bearing the symbols of Carthage. I also have a few spies in Corinth as well. They have not seen them either.
You have not docked a Carthaginian ship?
Bowen asked with shock. With a sly grin, Helga answered, saying, I didn't say that. I said I haven't docked a commercial ship since you left. I have ported many warships, larger than the second fleet of Rome, in fact. The Minotaurs are gearing up for war. Lurk would have been amused by the shocked look on Bowen's face if he wasn't as shocked as himself. Readying for war without an army sounds like the work of madness. Why? Malork wondered aloud.
Audentis fortuna juvat,
Bowen said with a snort. This seemed to get the other Romans to chuckle. Fortune favors the bold, Crassus translated. Surely you speak in jest, Master Rex. To march on Rome would be suicide, even with the might of your army to help.
Of course,
Bowen said with a chuckle. It died slightly before he added,
The king doesn't need me.
What do you mean? Octavius asked.
Something you Romans rarely think about is the sea, which I personally have always found amusing, since you live on an island. A simple blockade would suffice. Understand, even at the navy's strongest, it couldn't possibly blockade the whole continent.
Before he finished his glass of wine, the Minotaur grinned at the rest of the patrons and said,
But half? That's doable.
You think the king is planning on blockading Rome? Crassus asked curiously. Bowen shook his head.
No, I don't think he is. I think he is demonstrating his might. He's showing off to the highest bidder. Whoever pays King Garut will obtain his services. Honestly, my larger concern is still with what Helga just mentioned. Not one commercial ship has reached Rome's shores.
Helga shook her head.
Then where is he finding the money to build his ships?
Bowen mused.
He must not be paying the client tax to Rome anymore.
Oh, he does, Helga chimed in. When the fleet arrives at port, that is when they deliver the tax. With a raised eyebrow, Bowen asked Crassus.
Has Carthage's economy been burned by the embargo?
No. They still keep trade with the northern part of the Greek side of the continent. Yet even though they deliver wares to the Greeks, they are still feeling the decline in profit. Many of their trade is with us Latins, yet we have not seen them on our shores in quite some time. Shaking his head, Crassus continued. Sadly, such inflation has been put at the feet of the Greek consul. Graxus has made sure that the Roman people know that the economy's decline is the fault of the Greeks. But how did Nero garner such power with the people? A shocked Octavius asked. When we left, he was just honored with the office of quaestor, a show that he was moving up, but nobody moves that fast through the Senate. You do when you have an army of elven wizards, Crassus said with a grin. What? Malork said with shock. Yes. While you all have been up north fighting the good fight, an elven ship sailed into port of Croton, and Nero had the good fortune to be there when they arrived, going over some tax dispute. Taking a sip of his wine, Marcus continued. Their meeting, I assure you, was chance. Yet sometimes, luck plays into this world more than we would like. Nero got the elves to sign off on a trade treaty, which tripled the Senate's power and wealth. It also was a boon to the populace, more local trade selling at higher prices. It wasn't long before the people were praising Nero's name as well. Within the course of a year, Nero Graxus had made everyone in Rome rich, and he was honored for it with feasts and titles. At first, the Senate proposed that they name him Praetor, something very unusual for one so young. Yet Nero refused. He had greater ambitions.
He reached for the consul?
Bovin asked. No, Crassus said with a shake of his head. Governorship of the small province of Croton. Strange move, Octavius said quietly. Why? Malork asked with curiosity. With most provinces, Octavius explained, one would have to be consul, become governor. After your 5-year term as consul, you may serve one more term. Then the Senate honors you with land and the title of governor. The Senate votes on which of the 8 provinces you shall take command of. What of the old governor? He stays on as an advisor for 1 year, then is offered a villa with land in the province and given talent of 60,000 denarii every half year.
Damn. Just half of a governor's salary is what I make every 10 years.
Yes. In Rome we believe that life of servitude for the nobility of one's country garners wealth in retirement, Octavius said with a scowl. With a smile, Bowman extended his hand in peace.
Agreed. We must look after our elderly. I was just letting our friend Malork, who is not of our lands, know that is a lot of money.
Malork lifted his stein and responded. My thanks, Bovin. Yet one thing is not clear. Ain't you required to be a consul to be a governor? Seems like Nero sidestepped a few offices. Indeed he did. The province of Croton is far smaller than all the others, and has been given to those that have done something of true might for the Republic. Yep, Crassus said. And the Senate agreed that his trade negotiations had brought so much wealth to us that they granted him his request. That's where the wizards come in. Part of the deal that Nero had forgotten to tell the Senate about was once the papers had been signed, 10 elven wizards were granted to Nero to use for the next 10 years, provided he offered a villa up to the elven diplomat in Syracuse. Looking directly at Malork, Marcus said, We briefly spoke of the slave trade in Rome earlier. In Croton, it no longer exists. Shocked gasps came from both Bovim and Octavius, which confused Malork. Shouldn't this be a good thing? The abolishment of slavery everywhere should do, in his opinion, which he voiced. Good. Slavery is a detriment to all civilized races. Right? Looking at everyone in the room, he realized he didn't understand something. They all had dark looks on their faces, yet he couldn't understand why. He had at the very least spoken on the subject with Bovim, and he knew that the Minotaur was clearly against the act, yet the scowl the Minotaur gave him meant he wasn't seeing something. I agree with you, noble dwarf, Crassus said slowly, garnering the attention of Malork. Yet the abolishment of slavery totally, and as fast as it has taken place in Croton, is troubling. If I were, say, a farmer, with 15 slaves to help me till my land, then out of the blue someone came to me at the head of a group of soldiers and ordered me to free my slaves, what happens to me and my family? What happens to the farm? Malork thought about it for a second and then nodded with acknowledgement. The farm would be abandoned. With not enough people to farm the land, it could not be sustained. Precisely, Crassus said. If we can pull away from the terrible act of slavery, we must do so. Yet our economy must find a replacement. Something to take the place of the laborers. Either that or slowly integrate a system that allows pay to all, and ownership of person to no one. One takes time, the other a replacement.
So what did Nero replace slavery with?
Before Marcus could respond, Malork had already figured out the answer. Magic. Crassus lifted his glass towards the dwarf. Aye, well spoken. Yes, he used his 10 wizards to take the place of some 10,000 slaves. Not only is it working, with the benefit of magic he is increasing the profits of all menial labor. No longer are fields picked clean of weeds by slaves. A wizard sends a magical wind that exterminates weeds and parasites. Brought back a haul of fish from the ocean? No longer do you have to hire freemen or acquire slaves to gut and clean the fish. The fish market is operated by one wizard who dissolves the guts of the fish. He has brought the extinction of slavery with something cheaper: magic.
That sounds great, Octavius said slowly. But what happens in another 5 years, when the contract for the wizards is up?
Ah, yes, Crassus chuckled. Then you have a product that everyone will want, and more importantly, dependent on. Now it is far more expensive than free. The elves, mark my words, will come and collect. The group sat there in silence, each with their own thoughts of what was to come. The fate of Rome would come to fruition in 5 years, and it didn't look great for the smaller continent. Perhaps if you had another outlet for magic. Well, not offered by the elves, Malork said slowly. Something to keep them honest. Crassus shook his head. That would be a wise thing to do, yet the Senate backs Nero, and Nero backs the elves. Sad to say, it is already done. Don't you doubt that Nero will say that the cost of magic will be worth whatever they are paying to the elves?
You think they will be reasonable?
Hard to say, Helga stated. I personally have no love for any elf. Yet since they have been here, they have been nothing but agreeable and helpful. One might say it was a ploy, and if it is so, it's a damn good one. They have been nothing but generous. Your fleet returning puts you in an intriguing position, Crassus mused, to nobody in particular. How so? Malork asked. What could 2 Roman legions do? Crassus grinned. 2? If I recall, it was not just the 13th and 7th, but also the military might of our client kingdom, Carthage. 10,000 Minotaur warriors, if I recall?
Which numbers are half that now. It was hard fighting in the north.
So I have heard,
came a strange voice from the main hall, causing all heads to turn and view the stranger. Malork scowled and tightened the grip on his stein. So tight, in fact, the steel cup began to compress under the pressure. Skryia talk, the dwarf hissed. It was what the dwarves called their most hated enemy, the High Elf. Anger flared in Malork's eyes as he watched the High Elf enter the room. Draconian elves were the bane of any dwarf, alive or dead. Blue eyes and a slender jaw, with lips that always held a demeaning upturn. The elf was the true measure of his kind. Tall and slender, he glided across the room rather than walked. His bright white robe was tucked in close by a sapphire blue belt, while the sleeves of the robe were laced with golden silk. Pale by nature, his ears stood a good 2 inches taller than the top of his head, coming to a defined spear-headed point. His long golden hair cascaded down onto his slender shoulders. His demeanor was that of his race, regal, elegant, and superior. Even though there was hatred for the Karanis, or Dark Elves, Skryia were despised by all dwarves, for it was their hubris that had started the Beard-Elvian War. While the Dark Elves raided, the High Elves were the massive force that moved into the dwarvish lands, exterminating cities and killing hundreds of thousands of his kin. The story of Alcom was told to teach the cruelty of the Dark Elves, yet that was their only story. While the Dark Elves raided, normally it was in smaller parties and led by slavers. The Dark Elves were viewed as sadistic. The idea of them being evil monsters that preyed on those in the dark had changed drastically in Icekaiser, especially after the war in the north. Under a new ruler, they had forged an alliance with the dwarves through courage and blood, something that was not to be lightly forgotten. Priestess Misthrike had also started trade routes through rough negotiation with the king of Icekaiser. Now riches mined in the realm of Moscow flowed through the dwarven lands, as well as shipping through them to Irkutsk. The Festkog, or Wood Elves, had always been puzzling to the dwarves. Rarely were they seen outside of their beloved woods, and even during the Beard-Elvian War, they refused to fight. Their nation became a triage for wounded High and Dark Elves. It was rumored that the king of the Festkog was the one that brokered the peace with the dwarves, much to the chagrin of the High Elves. While the thoughts of the Karanis had shifted, things had not for the High Elves. There was no story for the High Elves because there were far too many. While not cruel, they viewed the dwarves as a stain on the world, something that needed to be purged. During the war, every town, city, or dwelling that was taken by the Skrytol was put to the torch, and every dwarf was exterminated. Surrender was not an option when it came to the High Elves. Sure, they offered it, but once they walked into your city or town, the purge began. High elves viewed all races below them not worth life, not just the dwarves, although they held a personal hatred for the high-minded elves, but all things that were not elves. Hell, they barely tolerated wood or dark elves, thinking of them as infant races, while on the path of glory. They still hadn't achieved such status as the high elves. Of all the races the Khan sent his emissaries, only one did not send support. He sent ambassadors of wood elvish descent to try to garner troops from Draconia, yet they refused. Not only had they refused, they scoffed at his offer and humiliated his emissaries. If Malork recalled right, the group of wood elves were sent back naked, forced to walk the long road back with not even the clothes on their back. Their nakedness, a so-called penance for siding with an orc. All possessions burned in front of them. The message they sent back was simple. If the priestess of the Dark Elves and the king of the Wood Elves were to prostitute themselves to an orc, then the conclave of the elves was no more, and Draconia annexed them from said conclave. The Khan had almost marched on Draconia when he heard these words, and if it wasn't so late in the game, Malork would have recommended it. Yet it was too late. They needed to march north to face Babolsa and his demonic hordes, not lose precious troops in a grudge match. Now, one of these haughty elves stood in front of him, and all he wished for was his mace, to wipe that stupid smug smile off the bastard's face. Lord Janad Kala, an unexpected pleasure, Helga said with polite surprise. I did not know you were coming. I can get you some food straight away. The elf raised his slender hand and said,
No need, Magister. My meal for the month was last Wednesday. Yet I would enjoy a glass of wine, whatever the host decides.
Helga bowed slightly, then motioned for a slave to bring the elf a glass.
I apologize for the intrusion at such a late hour. Yet I wish to speak with Senator Octavius before he left Syracuse. When I discovered he was here tonight, I rushed over.
Octavius stood and extended a hand, saying,
A pleasure. Unfortunately, I am at a loss. Being gone for so long from my home, who do I have the pleasure of addressing?
Instead of taking the Roman's hand, the elf bowed his head slightly and said,
My name is Janad Keller, emissary from the lands of Draconia, and uncle of His Majesty King Trian Bryn, lord of all that breathes, master of the Elves.
Malork snorted at the title. The elf shifted his gaze to the dwarf and said boldly,
Korak.
Malork's snort turned into a snarl. Standing, the enraged dwarf was about to hurl his stein at the elf, when Helga raised her hand, booming, Peace! I have no quarrel with the ambassador, and he is a guest under my roof. Stay your hand, Hellbreaker, or I shall call for my gods. Scowling at the woman, Malork got a hold of himself. Bowing to the hostess, he growled, My apologies, Helga. Alas, my stein is empty, and not up to the task of holding another beer. Perhaps you might help me find a new cup, and brew to fill it. Helga smiled patiently and nodded slightly. The dwarven maiden then grabbed him, none too gently, and scooted him from the pavilion, much to the squawking protest of Malork. Once they were out of sight, Helga let go of Malork, and before he could say anything, a look of pure hatred echoed from her face. Such a look of contempt gave Malork pause. Thane, the woman cursed, startling the berserker more. Such slanderous language. That damned elf has been the bane of my side since his arrival 5 feigning years ago. Malork chuckled, which was cut short by the glare of the hostess. Waggling her finger at Malork with a menace, she spat out, Don't you be making fun of me here, stunty. What with this swindling and double dealing, that pointy-eared bastard has most of my ships docked in Corinth now. That damned elf has been slowly draining all of my tax income from the docks dry. Holding a hand up in peace, Malork continued to chuckle. My apologies, Helga Jonska. I'm just so glad to see the dwarf come out of you. Helga's eyes cooled quickly, and she stammered out. My apologies, Master Hellbringer. You have caught me in a dark place, and so I have spoken out of turn. Scooping up her hands, he held them gently, and in a kind yet stern voice he said to Helga, Don't be daft, lass. I've been waiting ever since we met to see if you're a short human, or really a dwarf. It is good to know that you're a dwarf after all. The dwarven maid's cheeks flushed. She said, Herr Hellbringer, I assure you, I am as much a dwarf as you are. Prove it, Malork said with a mischievous grin. Confused, the dwarven lady responded with, how? Chuckling again, Malork gripped Helga around the waist and said, show me the best place in town for a beer. If I recall right, that's all I really wanted. A grin flashed across Helga's face. Yeah, then it dissipated. As fun as that sounds, I have guests. I cannot leave them. Malork nodded with a frown. His heart had gotten ahead of his brain. With a sad sigh, Malork nodded his agreement. She had company, after all. It would be rude if she ditched them to spend a night with him. Very well, lass. Perhaps then a fine brew from your cellar. He was about to ask the direction of the cellar when he noticed a smile on the magister's face. Before he could say anything, the dwarf bellowed out, "How dare you, sir!" Baffled, Malork was about to object when Helga whispered with a smile, "Play along. I got a way we can both get out of here." Not understanding what was going on, yet her smile was far more enticing than his curiosity. Instead of arguing or asking what was going on, Malork complied. "Damn you, dwarf! Give me an axe so I can rid Ashraka of the foulness of another derned elf." Stifling a giggle, Helga coughed and then, getting a hold of herself, shouted, "Best be off with you then, before I call my gods. Gods! I have an unruly dwarf that needs to be ejected from my villa." Alarmed at first when the guards showed up with spears and shield ready to stab him, the silent waving of Helga gave him pause as well as the guards. One human, who had a bright plume that spiked out over his helmet, slyly smiled at Helga and whispered, "Rendezvous?" With a quiet smile, Helga nodded and whispered, "If you wouldn't mind getting me my traveling cloak, Lucius, I will be going to the Dewdrop Inn." "Shall I prepare an escort?" Lucius asked. Helga shook her head. "No, I don't think that will be necessary tonight." The man bowed and motioned for the rest of the soldiers to disperse. As the men left the area, Helga grinned and said quietly, "Would you please wait by the door? I must attend to my guest. I shan't be more than 5 minutes." Crassus was confused. How did the ambassador know they were at his friend's house? From what he had seen of the night, it had been a very small get-together, something put together at the last minute. You can never tell with elves, the wizard mused. He must have spies everywhere. Not wanting to be held in mystery, Crassus asked, "Pray tell, Genad, what is the meaning of this unexpected surprise?" The ambassador took the glass from the servant who scurried towards him. Taking a small sip, the elf sat down on an unoccupied couch. With a thin smile, the elf acknowledged the other two in the room, yet kept Crassus's gaze, saying,
"Why, to congratulate the returning heroes of Rome, of course."
Crassus raised an eyebrow. "Congratulate? How? Just by your mere presence?"
"Of course not, Marcus,"
the Draconian said quietly.
"I offer tribute, as well as my appreciation, to what you did in the north. Why, if it wasn't for you, we would no longer exist. So the stories say."
"Stories?"
Bovin boomed.
"Why, yes. The stories of the grand exploits of you and those that served with you are telling,"
the elf said with ice.
"What has been rumored through all the realms is that the monsters of the world saved it. Orcs, minotaurs, and even Korok fought demons, and now all of us, other races, deserve to pay you tribute."
Before the other two in the room could object, Crassus asked, "You deny the stories? I have heard from the north through other means, and I can vouch for the rumors. It was truly a difficult war, which those that fought for Ashraka won." With an eyebrow raised, Crassus continued stating, "To say what these conquerors of Rome did was a fraud, why," his voice hardened with a stern look towards the elf, "they should be beaten for their insolence." Jalan glanced to his left and right, studying the room. Bowing very deeply, the elf stated,
"My sincerest apologies. I meant no disrespect. Apparently, Marcus Crassus has a better network of spies than the Draconian Kingdom."
With an extra dip of the head to Crassus, the elf continued stating,
"Like I said before, we of the Draconian Kingdom offer tribute. 10,000 pounds of pure diamonds, 30,000 pounds of exotic minerals, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and the like, to those leaders coming home from such an epic campaign."
Took all the strength the Roman had to not let his jaw drop. He was offering them both the wealth of the whole republic. Twice over. Both Minotaur and human glanced at each other. And who wouldn't? That was an obscene amount of money. About as much as the wizard had acquired throughout his entire life. Before Crassus could object, a roaring cry came from Malork in the other room.
Damn you, dwarf! Give me an axe, so I can rid Ashraka of the foulness of another damned elf.
A second or two went by, followed by their hostess bellowing, "Best be off with you then, before I call my guards! Guards! I have an unruly dwarf that needs to be ejected from my villa!" Everyone stood up, yet Crassus observed every reaction was different. Bovim's was much like his own, ready to defend Helga. While Crassus was ready to stand in defense for his friend Helga, he was sure that Bovim would stand in defense of his friend Malork. The other two's reaction was far more interesting. Octavius stood boldly, ready to be at the defense of the house, yet his eyes told a different story. This was one that could turn on a friend at a moment's notice, if the price was high enough. Yet he had watched a kingdom's wealth offered to the young man, and he didn't even flinch. No, this Roman was after power, control of Rome, nay, Ashraka. Janad, on the other hand, was harder to figure out. The elf's expression was so alien that Crassus almost couldn't decipher his thoughts. Yet the old Roman was an expert at understanding the hardest of micro-expressions. The only one he truly had problems with was the race known as the Ushaka. Crassus couldn't help himself. He shuddered. They were so alien, with those solid black eyes and gruesome teeth. He made it a point to avoid them when he could. High elves, on the other hand, you simply had to get past their aloofness to determine their thoughts. What Janad showed irritated Crassus more than he cared to admit. What hid behind his alien eyes was amusement. Before he could think more about it, Helga came storming into the pavilion, red-faced and obtusely angry. Storming up to the Romans in the group, she bowed stiffly and said, "My apologies. I have had to have one of my guests escorted from the building. Due to this strain, I will have Alan assist you with the rest of the night. I need a hot bath and some exercise to work off this anger." Octavius bowed deeply and said,
My apologies, Helga Jinska. Malork does require patience. After all, he's been living with orcs for quite some time. Some of their barbarity must have rubbed off on him. Perhaps there might be some way I can repay you?
The dwarf shook her head. "No, sir. As kind as that is, it will not be necessary." With a grin, Octavius said,
Are you sure? Perhaps I could set up a private meeting with Nero Graxus. Would that suffice for such terrible behavior my friend has shown tonight?
Helga tried to speak, yet no words came out. Shaking her head to clear it, she stammered, "Why, Praetor, you shock me. The rude remark of a drunken friend need not such a response." Octavius bowed low and said,
Nonsense! You shall ride with me to Rome. Why, you may ride my Appalachian pony, something I picked up traveling along the Dugong mountain range. Would you please accept my offer as my most sincerest apology?
Still flabbergasted, the dwarf nodded. A high honor to travel in the company of a praetor, let alone a private audience with the consul.
Very well! Ha ha ha! Octavius boomed. Alan, bring the wine that I brought with me, so that we may all drink of it.
"Of course, sir," came the ominous voice from behind them. Quietly, the gnome scurried past his mistress, around the corner and out of sight. As Octavius and Janad watched the gnome go, Crassus set his gaze firmly on Helga. Something wasn't right with this whole thing. Was he being set up again by Malork, or some different ruse altogether? The dwarf bowed to the rest of the party and then bid them adieu. Before she left, Bovim stopped her and held her in a quiet conversation, arousing more suspicion from the old man. Something was going on, and now the Roman felt too exposed. Yawning, Marcus strode over and shook Octavius's hand, saying, "Forgive me, Praetor. I am far too old to be out and about at this time, and I hear my bed calling. Thank you for the pleasant conversations." Octavius nodded as he grasped Crassus' hand.
The honor was all mine.
Bowing low to Helga, Marcus continued stating, I must be off. Thank you, kind Helga, for your hospitality and food. Even though I am sorely disappointed that we do not see each other more often, I think my physique is quite glad that we do not. If I was over here more often, I would probably weigh as much as a horse. Surely you could stick around for one glass of wine? Helga said with slight hesitation. No. I couldn't possibly, Marcus said with a chuckle, moving towards the dwarf in the door. I am sure you have brought a most wonderful vintage, Octavius, but even if Bacchus himself were to arrive from Olympus and produce me a wine of his own, I would have to pass. Helga placed herself between the exit and her old friend. With a raised eyebrow, he said nothing, yet sent the query down to the panicked-looking dwarf. Please stay for one glass, she said in a quiet whisper. I shall come to your house tomorrow to explain. Crassus held his suspicion for a moment longer, then relaxed. Helga had been a close friend for the last 15 years, proving herself time and again to be a true friend. Whatever it was, it had nothing to do with him.
Too bad. It was a gift to me from Sir Walter Greythorne, famed general of the mighty winged hussars from Irkutsk. When I asked him if it were a red or white, he said neither. He stated it was made from honey. With a chuckle, Crassus quickly nodded to the dwarf and then spun around with a flourish. You know, I think I shall have a glass. I've always wondered what mead tasted like.
Mead? How could you possibly known that was what it was called? Walking forward, he waved his left hand behind his back, motioning the dwarf to exit. Why, that is the correct name of the honeyed wine. It is only made in the far north in Irkutsk. The dwarves I have met said it is decent, yet most humans find the modest vintage to be better than most Roman wines. Certainly better than Greek or Iconian styles. What say you, Janad? Have you ever had such elixir before? As the old trickster plopped himself back down on a couch, the elven ambassador replied evenly.
Yes, I have. It is an interesting taste, better than beer, yet not as good as Gwyn Uchel, the small batch of wine that we make in Draconia. It is pleasant enough, though, that I suppose I shall have a glass.
The rest of the evening was spent rather well. So well, in fact, that they finished the bottle of mead. After one glass, the elf excused himself. Not much for conversation with the lower races. Yet the remaining three continued on. As enjoyable as it was, Marcus Crassus couldn't help but think of this meeting more like a favorite card game of his. Something from the western cities of Brighton called poker. In the game you were dealt cards, each hand having different chances of winning. The point of the game was to outplay your opponent. Make him think you had a better hand than you do, or less of a hand to conquer him. Each member of this party had their cards, all wondering what the other had, and by the end of the night none of them knew who had the winning hand. As Crassus left, traveling back to his villa, he thought this unfortunate. Each kept their secrets like cards in their hands. Once the outcome of each hand had been revealed, he was sure that the two would shift the spectrum of power in Rome. I seem to be caught up in the middle of it, Crassus thought, with a trail of fear behind the thought. His brain, as well as his lips, crafted a mischievous smile. Whispering to himself, the richest man in Rome said, Very well, let the games begin, and let no coin go unpolished. Well, wasn't that great? Join us next week with Chapter 6, A Bolt in the Dark. If you enjoyed these chapters, feel free to like, follow, and subscribe. And if you really enjoyed this, feel free to support us on our Spotify channel or YouTube channel,
Tales of Ashraka.
Have a great day. And as always,
Until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.